Ruth chapter number 1. I love that song, His Mercy is More. I think I said it last week, but if I work in my office 5 days a week, I think 4 days a week, that's how I start my morning of work. Think about His mercies, and I love that song. It's a good song. So here in Ruth chapter number 1, we talked last week about this family, the family of Elimelech, who left Bethlehem, Judah, the house of bread, because of a famine, and they traveled into the country of Moab, and some things happened. We talked a little bit about backsliding, and again, just kind of rehash it, review it. In verse number 1, it says this, "And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So a sojourn is where you just go to peek at something. You go to look. And again, the process of backsliding takes time. No one wakes up one day a strong Christian, following the Lord with all their heart and devoted to God and reading their Bible and praying, wakes up one day and says, you know what, I'm just not going to do that anymore. It's always a process. It's always a process. And then in verse number 2, the end of verse number 2, it says this, "And they came into the country of Moab and continued there." So it went from just looking, sojourning, to kind of sticking around a little bit longer than they had wanted to. Now he's a part of the culture. And we'll talk about that tonight. Now he's a part of their system, kind of like Lot. Remember with Abraham and Lot? He started here with Abraham. They split. He chose the well-watered plains of Jordan, and his tent moved closer and closer into Sodom and Gomorrah. Then look down at verse number, where'd it go? 4. Then, we'll look at this tonight, "And then they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the other name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Now they're situated. Now they're just in there, and they're 10 years. And we said this last week, it's one thing to backslide, but I think one of the saddest parts of this passage is that he took his family with him. He took his family with him. And so tonight, let's look at verse number 2, and we'll look at some of the people of the situation. Ruth chapter 1, verse number 2 says this, "And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons." Let's look at real quickly some of the people here in this passage. The man of the home, the husband of the family, his name is Elimelech. And it's always neat to see what names mean. Your name means something. Our children all have Hawaiian middle names. Finn, Walter, Kai. Kai is Hawaiian for ocean or water or river. Emmeline June Lehua. Lehua is a flower that's on the big island there of Hawaii, and it's a beautiful flower. Brooks, his name is Brooks Robert Koa. Koa means strong in Hawaiian. Our names mean something. Your name has a meaning, has a definition. And so when you look at some of the names of these people, it's interesting to see how it all plays out. And again, we can't say that their names is the exact reason why something happened, but it gives us some little background to the story. The name Elimelech means this, that my God is king. My God is king. The name Naomi means pleasant or beautiful. Now their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means this, sickly and unhealthy. Now Mahlon, Ruth chapter 4, tells us that Mahlon was the husband of Ruth. The other one is Chilion, and his name means pining or wasting away. Wasting away. Some parents may name their children after the circumstances of their birth. And again, during this time, infants being born, obviously sometimes there were some things that happened and they did not make it to their 1-year birthday. So Naomi and Elimelech could have named their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to reflect the weak condition of their birth. Again, you think of Esau. Esau's name means hairy. And so parents sometimes in the Bible would name their children after an event relating to their birth. I am not saying this is the reason, but I'm saying this could be a reason. Maybe her children were born during the time of the famine, and that's the time frame where they left Bethlehem, Judah, to go over into Moab. It could have prompted the move over to Moab. In verse number 3, we see that Elimelech dies. Elimelech dies. Verse 3 says this, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Life wasn't easier for this family just because they left Bethlehem to go over to Moab. Now, did they have food? Yes. But life wasn't easier because they chose to leave Israel to go over to Moab. They escaped a famine, but walked into death. They left a famine, but they walked into death. Moab was not taking care of them like they thought it would. The verse in the Gospels says this, if you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. And Elimelech tried to save his life. Again, talk about the spirit of backsliding, the spirit of walking away from God. And obviously, sometimes, growing up in church, this happens probably more with teenagers than it does adults like us in the room. You get that teenager spirit that says, I can't wait to get out of this house, and I'm going to be my own person, and I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm going to make my own rules, and I'm going to not go to church, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And they find out that life does not always go the way that they intended to go. Now, in verse 3, it says that he died. Elimelech died. A tragic event does not necessarily mean that God was judging him. Just because bad things happen doesn't mean that God was going to judge him. Okay? So how do you know? Well, in John chapter number 9, Jesus meets a blind man, and the disciples ask Jesus this ironic question. Jesus, this blind man that was blind from birth, who did sin? Him or his parents? Now, we hear that question, and we kind of chuckle a little bit. Now, how could he be sinning in the womb and be born? Sometimes when tragedy happens, it is not a judgment from God. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes we think that when we move away from something, we will move away from our problems. Our problems follow us wherever we go. Well, I'm going to leave Bethlehem, Judah. I'm going to take my family with me. We're going to go over here to Moab, God's water pot, and all my problems are going to go away. If I can just get away from the bad things over here, when I go over to here, my problems and all the bad things are going to go away, and life is going to be better. No matter where you go, you always bring yourself with you. Problems don't change because we change our location. Sometimes they just follow us wherever we go. There's an old saying that goes something like this: location doesn't change character, and location doesn't change your condition. He did not die. The text does not say he died because God smote him. It just says that he died. Now, verse 3 and 4, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And again, what's interesting, if you go back to verse 2, it says that Naomi was the wife of Elimelech, and they were his sons. And now that he dies, it says that that Elimelech was the husband of Naomi, and they were her sons. But look at verse 4. At the end of verse 3, it says, when she was left and her 2 sons, verse 4, and they took them wives of the women of Moab. Most likely, Elimelech died before his sons were married. Now again, at the end of verse 4, it says that they were there about 10 years. So they were probably some young adults. If you want to put in our culture, our time, they were probably 19, 20 years old. Some young adults, fresh out of high school, ready to greet the world. And here they're faced with the death of their father. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. So again, they stay in Moab for 10 years. Problems still followed this family. At first they had a famine, and now they have a death. And now they have a death. Again, it wasn't their location. It wasn't their situation. When you move, you take your problems with you, so learn how to fix your problems. The old saying goes like this: at the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. And this was a heart thing. This was a heart condition. Your decisions affect those around you. Verse 4 says that his sons married foreign women. Hold your place here in Ruth chapter 1. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7. This was interesting. And this may be one of those things that you have to come to your own conclusion on. And those are always fun. Okay? So it says that they married strange women, or women of Moab. We would call them strange women. Strange meaning different in belief or conviction. Not strange as though they were weird. Okay, now they may have been strange as far as that goes, but strange in the Bible means different in belief or conviction. Now this was something that, I'll just be honest, I'll be very honest tonight. I don't know if I have a definite answer on this. Everything I read and everything I looked at was a split vote. So this may be something that you may want to study on, and you come to a conclusion on your own. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. But look at Deuteronomy chapter 7. The sons married foreign or strange women. God gave them a command back in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that they were not to intermingle or intermarry with people other than the nation of Israel. Now look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, look at verse number 3. Actually, verse 1, we'll start at verse 1. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest, to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. So God says, when you get into this, you don't show these 7 nations mercy. You don't do anything with them. Okay? Verse 3. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. Why? For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly. So God told them in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that they were not to intermingle or intermarry with these 7 nations. Now here's the dilemma. Moab is not one of those 7 nations. So there's some people who say on this side of the conversation, well, their marriage to these strange women, these foreign women, was legitimate because they were listed in those 7 nations. But then there's other principles, other people over here who say, no, that's an enemy of Israel. We'll look at a verse in just a second in Ezra. After they got out of their captivity, they returned back to their land, and the men married women of Moab. And after they married these women of Moab, the leaders of Israel came along and took these strange women, these foreign, and threw them out of Israel because they were leading them back into idolatry. I think the bottom line for verse number 4 of Ruth chapter 1 shows you that now they were fully integrated into the culture of Moab, that they felt comfortable enough to date and marry the people of Moab. Again, go over to Deuteronomy chapter 23 now. Deuteronomy chapter 23. So again, there's some people who say, so that's why I'm going to leave that to your discretion. Maybe that may be a homework assignment for you this week, okay? We'll look at some other verses in just a second, but as of right now, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23. I think more so it shows that they had fully integrated themselves into the culture of Moab, that they were now dating their women and marrying them. Born at one time in Israel, they had forgotten the faith of their fathers. And now they were integrated into the culture, into the lifestyle of Moab. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 23. Look at verse number 3. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. So here we have some people on this side of the conversation are going to say, hey, God never told you not to marry the Moabites. But then you got the people over here who say, nope, don't even bring a Moabite into the congregation. 10 generations away, then we can even start considering it. Again, we mentioned it. Go to Ezra chapter 9. We'll look at it real quickly. We have time. Ezra chapter number 9. We mentioned this a few minutes ago, but look at Ezra chapter number 9. And look at verse number 1. I'm going the wrong way. There we are. Ezra chapter number 9. Again, they return from captivity. Israel returns from captivity, and the men of Israel start marrying Moabites and others, and they return them to their home. They ship them out. They send them back to where they came from. Look at Ezra chapter 9. Look at verse number 1. Now, when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been chief in this trespass. So here's this dilemma. Was their marriage here in Ruth chapter 1 wrong? The question is this: does God want his people to marry unsaved people? That's a dilemma. That's a problem. Now, later on in the New Testament, Paul makes it very clear for us today in our time frame that the children of light are not to go into the children of darkness. What fellowship hath light with darkness? The Spirit of God, the temple of God, with the children of Belial. God desires for his people to be with his people. When the sons married these strangers, the problem and the danger was that these strangers, these foreigners, would take their hearts from their God and turn it into their God. Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. Look at verse number 1, the life of Solomon. I wonder what Solomon would tell us. Now again, this was after the time of Ruth. So look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse number 1. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughters of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said to the children of Israel, ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come into you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Now here's the sad part about Solomon. Solomon clave unto these in love. These women took the heart of Solomon that was devoted to the Lord and put it on their gods. Now let's go back to Ruth chapter number 1. Ruth chapter number 1. What's interesting about Orpah is Orpah had no desire to follow the God of Israel. When they split, remember Naomi comes to them and says, hey, I don't have any children. I'm not pregnant. I'm too old to bear children. If I did have children, you have to wait for them to grow up and be married. Orpah in verse 15 says, fine, I'm out of here. Look at verse 15 and back in Ruth chapter number 1. And she said, behold, thy sister-in-law is going back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Orpah said, I'm out of here. I'm not going to follow the God of Israel. I'm going to go back and worship my God. So again, Orpah wasn't converting to the faith of Israel. She was returning to her own gods. God's people in our age, in our time, should not date unsaved people or marry unsaved people. It's a breaking of fellowship with light and darkness. Temple of God, temple of Belial. Now go back to verse number 5 of Ruth chapter 1. And I understand God can work anything out. I get that. I believe that, okay? God could take any situation and turn it into something beautiful for his honor and for his glory. But I still think in the New Testament age, that's a solid principle that we see. Now, verse 5, you were talking about going from bad to worse. Naomi's husband dies. Now look at verse number 5. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. I mean, you go from bad to worse. It's one thing for your husband to die. You got 2 strong young adult men who can help you, can support you, who can take care of you. And all of a sudden, they die too. So here's Naomi, whose name means pleasant and beautiful, now is alone. I'll say this as delicately as I can and as kind as I can, but this is the dark side of the providence of God. God was still working a plan in the life of Naomi. God was still painting a picture. God was still at work. But again, let's put ourselves in Naomi's shoes for just a minute. You lose your husband. You lose your 2 sons. You're in a foreign land, no family, looking for help, living off the generosity of the strangers, trying to do the best you can, and this is all piling up on you. Again, just like Elimelech, the text here does not criticize Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, nor does it go into detail as to how they died. It just plainly says they died. The bottom line is these 3 women are now left alone. And it's not like our day. There was no government assistance. There was no family and friends that you could say, hey, come in here and help me. They were literally all alone. That's the baseline reality of this issue. Now we're going somewhere. We're painting a picture. Here's where God's providence kicks in, though. The Bible says at the end of verse 4 that they dwelled there about 10 years. 10 years. In that 10 years, or of the time that they were married, Orpah and Ruth, Mahlon and Chilion, Ruth, Orpah, never got pregnant. They were never pregnant. Why? Because God was working his plan. His providence was coming to pass. The word providence, the word pro means ahead. Video means to see. God was looking down the road at a picture that was going to be beautiful. It may have looked ugly right here. It may have looked ugly and dark and hopeless and helpless for Naomi right here. But God wasn't worried about keeping Naomi right here. He was getting her down the road to a beautiful, beautiful picture. Naomi, being a widow, being a childless, heirless widow, put her in a very low class. No support. Again, relying on the generosity of strangers. No immediate family. Living in a foreign country. I mean, you want to talk about hopeless and helpless. When we are at our worst, God is at his best. When she was brought low, that's when God says, I'm going to start working. When we are down to nothing, I mean, literally, she has nothing. When we are down to nothing, God is up to something. The El Shaddai does not need anything to work his plan. He doesn't need us. He didn't need Naomi to have money, to have a family. God needs nothing to work with. And that's exactly where Naomi was. She couldn't rely on her strong husband. She couldn't depend on her 2 young adult sons to provide for her, to take care of her. The only place Naomi could turn, the only person that could pick her up out of her predicament was God. Turn to Psalms 146. Psalms 146. Naomi is on the verge of experiencing the hand of God. I am a firm believer in the providence of God, that God is in control of every situation. We talked about this last Sunday morning. When her world was shaking and crumbling, it seems all around her, God was still in charge. God was still in control. God was not worried or nervous or fretting. He says, Naomi, I have you right where I want you. Believer, God has you right where he wants you. He may have to take some of those safeguards away. Again, sometimes that dark side of the providence of God has to happen in order for us to see the sunlight of his beautiful providence. Look at Psalms 146. Look at verse number 9. The Lord preserveth the strangers. He relieveth the fatherless and widow. But the way of the wicked he turneth upside down. He preserveth the strangers. He relieveth the fatherless and the widow. God had Naomi in a safe place. Now, did it look safe to her? No. But in the grand scheme of things, in the big picture of life, God said, Naomi, you're right where I need you to be. You're right where I want you to be. Someone had wrote this. I don't know who it was. I tried to find the author. And so usually when that happens, I just take credit for it. Okay? But no, I don't know who wrote this, but it fits into this story. He will be your heart's sure comfort, counselor divine, and friend. Coming years need not distress you. He will guard you to the very end. He was going to take care of Naomi. Now again, let's put ourselves in Naomi's shoes again. How is it all going to happen? She has no clue. How is it all going to come to pass? I don't know. I have 2 daughter-in-laws. One's going to go back to her home. One's going to go back and worship her gods. And one's going to stay with me. Again, we have the privilege of instant replay. We have the privilege of going back and saying, okay, this is what Naomi's going to be okay. But let's put ourselves in her shoes. What is happening? What is going on? Where do I go from here? I'm in the lowest of the classes of Moab, and I'm all by myself. God orders the disorders of men for his glory. Let me say that again. God orders the disorders of men for his glory. Turn to 1 Corinthians. Again, hold your place in Ruth 1, but go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Widows, from a human perspective, would seem to be a very unlikely candidate for playing out the Lord's plan of redemption. I think if we were writing the narrative, if we were writing the story of God's redemption story, I don't think we would have picked a widow like Naomi to introduce the Messiah to the world. And yet, over and over again, we know that God's ways are not our ways. We sang the song tonight, God will make a way where there seems to be no, he works in ways we cannot see. He will make a way for me. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, look at verse 27. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. If we're writing the story tonight of God's redemption plan, I don't think we say, yeah, let's use a widow like Naomi. She's going to bring Ruth with her, and they're going to go back. We'll talk about this next week. They're going to go back into Israel. They'll go back to Bethlehem, Judah. I don't think that would be our story. I don't think that would be our narrative. But God chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and the weak things to confound the things which are mighty. Let's summarize Naomi's path. She's old. She's barren. She's alone. No husband, no sons. She has 2 young daughter-in-laws, both strangers, both foreigners, both barren. She is running on empty, and all hope seems lost. Again, when we are down to nothing, God is up to something. God's hand of providence is shown to clearly be in control and order Naomi's steps one by one. Naomi, you lost your husband. Naomi, you lost your 2 sons. Watch me, kind of like you did with Abraham. Abraham, follow me, come with me. Where are we going? I'll tell you when we get there. Naomi, here's what's going to happen. You're going to lose everything. You're going to lose your safeguards. You're going to lose your security. You're going to lose everything. Just come trust me, Naomi. Follow me, Naomi. Let me lead you. Let me guide you. The need for Ruth to stay with Naomi was all a part of God's plan in orchestrating the human lineage through which the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come into the world. Now, 10 years there, not one of them times did Ruth ever get pregnant. Not one time did Orpah ever get pregnant. Why? Because God was still in control. When your life seems like it's not in control, and it's kind of up and down and shaking the snow globe, just remember that He is. He's working a plan. He's working a picture. You ever look at an artist paint something? I sometimes like watching videos on Instagram of artists painting something. I was watching some this afternoon while my kids were doing, I don't know what they were doing, but I was watching videos this afternoon. And they start off, they take their paintbrush and they just start on something, and you're like, how is that going to be put into the Louvre because of some great artwork and some classic? How does a guy just penciling something in turn into like this beautiful sunset and this beautiful mountain and this beach somewhere? Because when artists start a painting, they start very small, and then they build on top of that. God was working a picture out here that at the beginning didn't look so pretty. It didn't look like it was coming together. But because, again, we have the benefit of instant replay, we can come back and look at the text and look at the verse and look at the passage and study it out. We know what God's doing. Naomi didn't. And sometimes in our life, we don't know what God's doing. But God is always working a plan. Go to Isaiah chapter 47. Isaiah chapter 47. Trust His plan. Trust His plan. Isaiah chapter 47. When all hope is gone, help is on the way. When all hope is gone, I've lost my husband, I've lost my son, I lost my other son, I lost my daughter-in-law left, she went back to serve her gods. God, what are you doing? When all hope is gone, help is on the way. Look at Isaiah chapter 47, look at verse number 9. But these 2 things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day: the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection. For the multitude of the sorceries and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. Go over to Isaiah 51. Isaiah chapter 51. And look at verse number 19. These 2 things are come unto thee. Who shall be sorry for thee? Desolation and destruction, and the famine and the sword, by whom shall I comfort thee? There was only one person who could bring Naomi the comfort that she desperately needed. The Lord. God. God was going to work in the life of Naomi. She's right on that verge. And Christians, sometimes we're right there on that verge where life is bad and there's troubles and there's stress and there's pressure and there's this and there's that. And we can turn away or we can remain faithful. I really believe sometimes we miss miracles, whether it be in prayer or whether it be just in faithfulness, because we quit right before God blesses. Naomi did not quit. She wasn't perfect. She followed her husband, but she was faithful. She said, God, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to lead, and we'll talk about that next week. When all hope is gone, help is on the way. Don't quit. Don't quit. You may feel like Naomi tonight. The world is shaking and all this is going on, and what's going to happen? Trust God's hand. Trust God's plan. Trust his providence. Do we always know how the end of the story goes in our life? No. But just trust him. Every head bowed, every eye closed. Naomi lost everything.